Good morning, Friday morning. Friday on my side of the world, Friday morning. Anyway, welcome to the weekly episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Evan Sarmiento, and welcome. I am coming to you live from what was the most controversial city in North America these past few weeks. But we're now in 4 to 6 inches of snow and more coming throughout the day. So it's actually beautiful outside when you start to watch it. Um, the one thing about living in a place like this where you got snow in winter is sometimes people complain about how cold it is, because it is true, it is cold, because that's what winter should be. But then the good thing that I've experienced when we were locked down and we were, I want to say, trapped with all these pandemic stuff going on, is you get to appreciate how beautiful the winter season really is. And that's when I started going out and going on hikes and exploring the outdoors more with, of course, proper winter gear. That way you don't freeze to death. Learn my lessons on my first year being here. Yes, that's kind of like the uh, the way to enjoy and have fun with what you already have. Today's topic, before I get into the philosophical and the metaphysical descriptions of today's topic, is all about Windows Server Failover Clustering. And interestingly, I started collecting questions from the people who submitted those questions. If this is the first time you are joining in, there is a link down below where you can submit your questions so that I can answer them during these AMA sessions. There's a category there about the question. Where does it fall into? And every week I come up with a theme or a category that that deals with SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. And I cover all aspects of SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, not just the technology aspect of it. I'm a big fan of looking at the people and the process side in addition to looking at the technology. For me, technology is just an enabler. It's interesting because we technical professionals will focus on the technology first. Like, yeah, I want to deploy an always on availability group, or I want to deploy a failover clustering. Oh, this version of Windows, this version of SQL, this edition, this architecture. And we are so fixated on the technical aspects, not realizing that's not going to work if you don't look at the people, because a cluster is not going to build itself on its own. Even if you do have an automation process, the automation is still made by humans. So you have to consider the people and the process aspect of building a high availability and disaster recovery solution. So um, submit your questions. There's a link down below. And if you're on LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter, say hi. Hi. Yes. Hi, everyone. And I wanted to prefix this, and the reason I wanted to focus on Windows Server Failover Clustering is, for one, when Microsoft released SQL Server 2017, they came up with this, I want to say, nice and shiny feature called read scale availability groups. And their marketing message was all about, you can build an always on availability group without a failover cluster. Yes, you can, which is also kind of ironic because the term always on availability is in there when it is not a high availability solution. The understanding, though, and in the abstract or in the description of this of this session, I talked about not just Windows Server Failover Clustering, but Cluster Resource Manager in general. Okay? And again, there's a lot of confusion with customers who are looking at always on availability groups and realizing, oh, really? I can build an always on availability groups without a cluster? Yes, you can if you are on SQL Server 2017 and higher. The thing about this is the footnote. I don't want to say the footnote, but the highlight in the Microsoft documentation came in a little bit later because of all of these confusion, where Microsoft explicitly said this is not a high availability solution. What makes always on availability groups, or SQL Server Failover clustered instances, that is, What makes SQL Server high availability solutions possible, even when you're hearing stuff like always on, you're hearing stuff like a high availability. What makes that possible is not SQL Server. It is a cluster resource manager. And I'm throwing in a generic term, cluster resource manager, because when SQL Server 2017 came out and supports running on top of Linux, well, we can't really talk about Windows Server Failover Clustering if your SQL Server is running on Linux. You can run Linux Pacemaker as an example of a cluster resource manager or a third-party cluster resource manager. Bottom line is SQL Server relies so much on the cluster resource manager, whether it's on the Windows platform or the Linux platform, for it to achieve high availability. And it's interesting because in the history of SQL Server high availability in this context started with database mirroring, where the SQL Server product team, and of course people would say, no, we have SQL Server 7 and failover clustered. Bear with me for a second. With database mirroring, Microsoft attempted, the SQL Server product team attempted to let SQL Server handle the HA portion of it. Thus, database mirroring came with a principal and a mirror and then a witness. They came up with these concepts, but then realizing after 3 versions, because 2005, 2008, and then 2008 R2 came out, after 3 versions later, they realized, why are we investing engineering money, resources, all of these things, man hours on building something that we already have as a company? And they realized, look, Windows has been running failover clustering for ages, going back to the days of Wolfpack. And when people hear me say Wolfpack, they, oh, you're old. Only people who understood code names back then know that this is the Windows NT4 version of the Microsoft cluster services. And so this is the foundation of always-on availability groups when you look at high availability. We're not talking about disaster recovery. We're talking about high availability. In the context of high availability, SQL Server relies so much on the underlying cluster resource manager. In the case of Windows, it is the Windows Server Failover Clustering. And in the case of Linux, it's the Linux Pacemaker. Now, here's the thing. The most common mistake that a lot of SQL Server DBAs make, and sysadmins, and I want to include anybody who is taking care of an always-on availability group. And because I've been working with so many sysadmins, IT professionals who have a little bit of background in SQL Server, but they're not a full-blown SQL Server DBA, and they need to be responsible for always-on availability groups. They fall on either the SQL Server side, I'm going to take care of the SQL Server side, or I'm going to take care of the Windows Server Failover Clustering side, but not both. And this is specifically true when we're looking at DBAs and sysadmins from the healthcare industry, the financial industry, the legal industry, because they've got segregation of duties. And so it is challenging to really understand what is going on the Windows Server Failover Clustering side or on the SQL Server Failover Clustering side. And the frustration that I see most of the time is this. The availability group goes offline. It had an outage. The DBA would do everything he can, but then he does not know what is causing the problem, because anytime he attempts to bring the availability group online, it won't. And so they kind of get anxious about the fact that they're experiencing outages and they feel like they cannot do anything about it. It's pretty helpless when you think about it, because you're responsible for something. In this case, the database is inside the availability group, but you're not capable enough to even do anything about this, right? In the same way, when somebody just focuses on the Windows Server Failover Clustering side, they took care, they did everything that they can on the Failover Clustering side, but then they still could not bring the availability group online. It kind of throws them off and again, be in that helpless situation because they can't do anything. And the reality is, you have to know both sides of the equation, not just one or the other, not just failover clustering, not just SQL Server, not just always on available groups, but both Windows and SQL Server. And this is very important. That's why I really want to focus on this. And the thing about this is the platform that makes, as I mentioned in the beginning, the platform that makes always on availability groups highly available is the Windows Server Failover Cluster. Let me rephrase that, is the Cluster Resource Manager. Of course, in our case, because we'll be focusing on Windows, it's the Windows Server Failover Clustering platform. So that's why it is very, very important. I know a lot of people would say, or a lot of DBAs would say, I don't really have permissions. I can't. I'm at the mercy. The word that they use is I'm at the mercy of the Windows sysadmins taking care of the failover cluster, which means if you really think about that, your job is now dependent on the things that you have no control over. So if somebody screws up, even if it's not your problem, you're toast. We are literally the default blame acceptors, whether or not we want it. And we have to change that because your career, your skill set will, well, of course, your progression in the company that you work for is at the mercy of you not knowing what to do in case something goes wrong with the Windows Server Failover Clustering. This is the foundation. You cannot build a multi-story building if the underlying foundation is not rock solid. And it's not enough for you to just know. It is important for you to become well-versed, to master this platform, this technology, because even if you don't know, or rather, even if you cannot do anything about it because you don't have the permissions, you can guide a person doing it because you know exactly what is going to happen if they did this. I was actually working with a client this past couple of days, weeks, where they had this exact same thing. And in fact, it's one of the questions that I saw on the queue. So let me start with the very first question on the queue. I'm going to read it, of course. When configuring failover clustering in general, whether it's 2008, of course, I do hope you're no longer deploying 2008 or 2012 R2 still. I still hear people say, yeah, we are deploying Windows Server 2012 R2. Nothing against it. It's just that you got to think of mainstream support and extended support and all these things that you have to consider as part of you supporting it. Because if Microsoft is not going to be supporting it, then I do hope you know exactly what you're doing moving forward. Anyway, when configuring failover clustering, I don't see much information on settings for the NICs. I'm guessing he meant network interface cards. NICs. Do we still need a heartbeat network? Can it be on the same subnet as public addresses? I actually cover this in detail in my SQL Server Always On Availability training class. But basically, I'm guessing this is coming from decades old information about creating a failover cluster with multiple network adapters, and with that, having a dedicated network adapter for heartbeat. That's how I'm interpreting this. And it's he's asking, can it be on the same subnet as public address? So let's break this down in more detail and look at what exactly is the question. Number one, he's asking, I don't see much information on settings for the NICs. The reason why you don't see a lot of information on the network adapters, whether you are reading a blog post or an article or something like that, is because, number one, there are very few people who understand how networking works. I mean, the nitty-gritty details of how networking works. Sure, they know the concepts, but the way these are configured, they're not really familiar with it. Okay, that's one. Number two, of course, they're not Cisco certified, they're not Juniper certified, and so configuring this is given to the Windows sysadmins. Which, of course, it's different when you're looking at it from the operating system side, the networking side, versus what the network administrators or the network engineers understand. That's one. Number two, the reason why you don't see a lot of information about, or much information about, setting of the network information cards or network interface cards, LAN cards, is because In today's world of virtualization and cloud computing, that becomes irrelevant. And I'm not saying you don't need it. I'm just saying you can't really do anything about it. Would you plug in, I'll just use VMware or Hyper-V or any on-premises cloud or virtualization platform. You can put in 4 or 16 virtual NICs in there, but how sure are you that they're actually plugged into 16 different network interfaces, physical that is, and they're attached to multiple network switch, independent network switch, that are on different racks plugged into different power distribution units attached to all of these things, because we can create this massively complex architecture, multiple network adapters, but then for what? Don't get me wrong. I'm a big believer of having multiple paths towards, or multiple paths to connect the net cluster nodes. I'm thinking of something else. I am a firm believer of having multiple network paths to the nodes in your failover cluster. Why? Because there's one reason, or well, not one, but there's a primary reason why you are running SQL Server on top of a failover cluster. You want high availability, and high availability comes with resiliency, with fault tolerance, with reliability. So if you only have a single network adapter and that thing dies, then there's no reliability, there is no resiliency, there's no fault tolerance. Therefore, you cannot achieve high availability. But then on the cloud, how can you guarantee? How can you guarantee that it is actually plugged in, that virtual NIC is plugged in to a dedicated network switch with its own power distribution unit? On the cloud, sure, they will tell you this is how it is, but there is no guarantee. You cannot just walk into someone else's data center, or Azure or AWS or GCP or Rack. You cannot just walk into their data center and confirm, oh yeah, this NIC is attached. You can't, right? But at the end of the day, you have to have that compromise. I'm still a big believer of having multiple paths to the nodes in the failover cluster, because I've seen a lot of these cases where somebody built a VMware infrastructure. They've had multiple nodes in the VMware cluster hosts, and their failover cluster, their guest clusters, have multiple virtual network adapters, because that's how, quote unquote, somebody else did it. And when you start to look at it, the virtual NIC, even though they got like 4, they're all mapped to the same physical network card on the host. It defeats the purpose of having multiple network adapters. Okay? Test but verify, or rather trust but verify. You have to verify that. Then in addition to that, there are a lot of things about having anti-affinity with the VMs and hosts. Again, it is a little bit more challenging in the world of virtualization and cloud computing, because you can't really guarantee, you can't really make sure that on AWS, even if you have like multiple virtual NIC network adapters, are you sure that they're actually physically plugged into they have their ways of provisioning for moving resources around just in case something happened. But again, that's totally out of our control. Okay. The thing about this is the heartbeat network. There is this confusion about the heartbeat network, because in the past, like I said, going back to the days of Windows NT4, Windows 2000 Advanced Server, Windows Server 2003, where Microsoft wants you to create a dedicated NIC, a dedicated network adapter for heartbeat communication traffic. Like I said, I'm still a big believer of that. I'm still a big fan of that, because we want to achieve high availability, and with high availability comes fault tolerance, resiliency, and reliability. Okay. But with Windows Server 2008, Microsoft allowed you to build a failover cluster even with a single network adapter. even with a single network adapter. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. In fact, I worked with a client from way back 2012. Yeah, 2012. They're a big gaming company, and they built this like 5-node Windows Server Failover cluster. And the first thing that I saw was, and it's a physical machine, by the way, they built this failover cluster with 5 nodes, and they had like 4 physical NICs, but Windows only sees one. And I asked the question, I'm just curious. I said, how come I only see one network adapter here? And they said, oh, we got it all teamed. We applied NIC teaming, we tested it, we've validated, so we're all good. Even if Windows only sees one network adapter, it's actually 4 teamed, and Windows only sees one. And the curious guy that I asked, so are they plugged into different network switches? And that was when they started reassessing. Oh, they're plugged into different network switches, but the network switches are all plugged into the same power distribution unit. And so these are the things that you have to really think about, because starting with Windows Server 2008, even though Microsoft gave you the ability to create a failover cluster without an additional network adapter, even if it's just one, okay, you have to think about high availability, which comes with it. And I keep repeating myself because, again, you have to understand that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Reliability, fault tolerance, resiliency, all of these things factor in when you're building something like this. Now, for the heartbeat network back then was a dedicated network. Now, it's like the failover cluster will use any available network adapter. And the good thing about this is the heartbeat network is simply internode communication. One node is talking to the other node. Are you fine? Are you healthy? Are you okay? And then the other node would respond and say, you sure? I'm fine. I'm healthy. I'm okay. And I'm responding. Same thing, right? Now, with Windows Server 2008 onwards, the cluster will use any available network adapter to send heartbeat communication traffic or heartbeat communication messages. It will use, if you have one, of course, it will only use one. If you have 2, it will use the public, and I'm guessing that's where this question is coming from. It will use the public network adapter as well as that dedicated network adapter. People still call it heartbeat network. Sometimes I refer to it as heartbeat network. But in reality, no, there is no dedicated heartbeat network, because the cluster will use all available network adapters to send and receive heartbeat messages to all of these failover cluster nodes. So again, this is the reason why you don't see much of that information, because for one, Windows Server 2008 gave you the ability to build a failover cluster with a single network adapter. So what's the point of configuring it? But like I said, go back to your reason why you want to run SQL Server on a failover cluster. That's high availability. And high availability comes with it fault tolerance, resiliency, availability, right? And making sure that everything is redundant. So think about that as I move on to the next one. Next question. Right. I've seen examples. Question number 2. I've seen examples of how to configure a failover cluster without Active Directory. We want to deploy our always-on available groups without Active Directory. How do I go about it? I actually wrote a 2-part series article on MS SQL tips on how to go about this. And this was coming from a lot of customers in the past where they were running database mirroring on work groups, mind you. So you got database mirroring on work groups. You have certificates involved in order to configure that. And when they wanted to move to always on availability groups, they were thinking, wait, there is no one-to-one mapping between database mirroring with certificates to always on availability groups. Okay. Not to mention, if you are coming from standard edition SQL Server back in those days, running database mirroring, and you want to move to availability groups, there is no equivalent edition. Yeah, there isn't. You got to be on Enterprise Edition. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of customers back then, they don't even want to upgrade to SQL Server 2014 or 2012 because, well, I'm running on Standard Edition. Why would I move to Enterprise Edition just to get a vet? And my databases are working. And so they really have to rethink moving into a newer version that does not support their current environment. Enter SQL Server 2016 that supported running Standard Edition. Not to mention, with Windows Server 2016 as well, with SQL Server 2016, you can now build an availability group on top of a Windows Server Failover cluster without Active Directory. It's no different from you running SQL Server 2017 on Linux clusters without Active Directory. It's the same thing, okay? The only difference, of course, is in this case, it's Windows. And you know what it is, or how it is. When you talk about Windows, it immediately comes with the idea of having Active Directory. Now, the thing about this is just, and probably you've heard of this, as I said it earlier, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. What is your goal for running SQL Server always on availability groups on a cluster without Active Directory? What is your goal? Because if it's simply for experimental purposes you want to learn, go ahead and do it on a lab, but not on a production environment. Because one, you have to think about, number one, how do you manage your certificates? Do you have a proper process in place for managing certificates? Because I have dealt with so many people in the past where they were panicking because they realized their certificates have expired and they don't know what to do. And they start to freak out. And they couldn't sleep for a couple of weeks until I told them, look, you wouldn't have this problem if you have Active Directory. Okay, so that's one. And remember, as I mentioned in the beginning, I focus more on the people in the process aspect rather than just jump into the technology. Sure, that you can easily do this. It's, if you follow the guide that I provided, you can easily do this. But how many people on your team, number one, know how to deal with certificate management? If you decide to use public certificates rather than your own internal certificates, how do you proceed with requesting certificates, re-importing them back onto your infrastructure when they expire? How do you deal with that? Do you have a process in place? Because you don't think about that when your infrastructure is already in production. You think about it even before. Number two, how many people on your team know how to do this? If you know how to do this, fine. But how well versed are you in renewing certificates when they expire? Especially public certificates. And I'm not talking about SQL Server certificates here. I'm talking about the Windows side of things when it comes to those certificates. Well, of course, there's the SQL Server side of things as well. You have to think about that. How are you keeping? How are you maintaining? How are you rotating? How are you renewing? Okay, you have to think about that. Number three, why would you want to run always on available groups on top of a failover cluster that does not have Active Directory? I've worked with several customers where they're an all Linux shop. Their developers are running Linux. They've got users using, or end users using, a MacBook like I am. There are people who are doing Java development, Python and PHP and all of these things. But because their databases are running on SQL Server, they have Active Directory. Because they want the advantage and the ease of use of letting Active Directory deal with all of the centralized authentication and credential management and security and ACLs. And that's one of the reasons why I said just because you can doesn't mean that you should, because you have to think about the overall maintenance and operations cost associated with doing something like this. I think I've only done like 2 or 3 of these in production because they really need it. Right? They're on a DMZ and they don't want to open up firewall ports from their DMZ to their internal environments, and they also don't want to deploy Active Directory in their DMZ, and so they just went ahead and did it. Okay, but they know the risks. They know the amount of work that's needed in order to build and maintain. We're not just talking about building. The building is a one-time thing, but maintaining it like I said earlier, certificate renewal, um, uh, recycling. I don't. It's not recycling. Anything that has something to do with certificate management, you have to really think about that and factor that into your operations procedures. Okay, that's the second question. Third one, oh, this one's interesting. Third question. We have a 2-node failover cluster with a 2-replica AG across 2 data centers. Ooh. Okay. We have a 2-node failover cluster with a 2-replica AG across 2 data centers, and we are experiencing outages every time our network service provider does maintenance. How do we prevent this from happening? Well, tell your network service provider to not do any maintenance. That's one. This is one of the reasons why in the beginning, I emphasized how important failover clustering is. Because your databases inside an availability group are sitting on top of a failover cluster, it doesn't matter, okay? It doesn't matter if your SQL Server databases are fine, your SQL Server instances are fine, they're healthy, they're working perfectly normal. It doesn't matter if your availability group is okay. If you lose your cluster because you lost quorum, it is going to take everything offline, including the availability groups, which includes all of the databases in there. In fact, that you're across data centers. I don't really understand why you're in 2 data centers. I've seen this happen so many times in the past, and it was a byproduct or a result of somebody not understanding how the underlying platform works. It's just like saying somebody decided to drive a stick car with manual transmission, but didn't know how to use the clutch, so he would just move the clutch or the I don't know why I'm thinking like this. Started moving the gear stick anytime he wanted, and then all of a sudden he broke the transmission down. Not understanding how the platform works would end up in situations like this. There was one case I worked with a couple of years ago, and this was the very first days of SharePoint. Yes, the very first days of SharePoint. SharePoint 2013 was released, and in their documentation, there's a ton of information and references about using always-on availability groups. As I was building the availability group, I noticed that there was something wrong with their file share witness. They were using a file share witness, and I noticed that there was something wrong. I told them, look, pay attention to this. It's throwing a bunch of errors on the Windows event log. Have a look at this, because it is going to cause you problems. And of course, I made sure that it is on an email so that they have a reference. I opened a ticket and said, fix this. Said, sure, we'll fix it, we'll monitor it, and so on and so forth. 3 months later, or 3 months after, I get a phone call. The sysadmin was telling me that their entire SharePoint farm is offline. Now, I kind of know exactly why, but then I asked the question, so tell me more. What happened? I asked him to explain what happened, and he said, well, we were just doing our typical patch Tuesdays. And by the way, if you haven't watched my episode on patching and maintaining always-on available groups or SQL Server HA solutions, go watch that. But they were explaining, sure, we applied the Windows security patch on the secondary replica on the standby node, rebooted it, and all of a sudden, our entire SharePoint farm became unavailable. And I had to keep quiet for a couple of minutes. And they were asking me, hey, are you still there? Like I said, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I so hate to be the bearer of bad news. That's by design. And they were like, what? And yeah, they blamed me for something that I told them it is by design. And when they asked me, so what do you mean it's by design? Well, you have 3 voting members in your failover cluster, 2 nodes and a file share, 2 nodes and a witness. Your witness is not functioning properly, which I told you 3 weeks ago that you need to fix. That's 2 out of 3 votes. You still have majority. And then you rebooted your secondary. Yes, you rebooted your secondary. That's 1 out of 3 votes. The cluster does not have quorum at that point, has to take itself offline together with the availability group. Sure, you can still access your system databases because your system databases are not in the AG, but the cluster lost quorum. And they were like, what? Yes, it is by design. You're actually seeing how it is intended to work. It's just like saying, you're telling me that the car actually moves? Yes, because that's how it was designed. And they didn't like my response, but I said, that's one of the reasons why I told you 3 weeks ago, you gotta fix the file share witness. Because this is going to be an issue. And in their entire SharePoint farm went offline because of this. Mind you, there was nothing wrong with the primary replica. There was nothing wrong with SQL Server. There was nothing wrong with the databases. Nothing. They didn't even reboot the primary. They didn't even touch the primary. They just rebooted the secondary. And because of that, the cluster lost quorum, had to take itself offline. This is by design. I spend an entire module on talking about quorum and the cluster using and leveraging quorum and what affects high availability in cluster. Because it's that important. In fact, the one thing that I realized doing this for years is that when you read the Microsoft documentation, the quorum is the most complex, most confusing, and the most convoluted concept there is, yet it is the most important one. It is the most important concept because you don't have quorum, you don't have a cluster. If you don't have a cluster, you don't have an AG. And that is kind of when you start to see all of these issues coming up because a lot of sysadmins do not have a really good understanding, and DBAs included, not have a real good, solid understanding of the quorum. That's why you really have to be aware of this, even if you're not the one responsible for the Windows Server Failover Cluster, because your job is on the line. Yes. I have to slow it down so that it really sinks in. So that's one. It is by design when the second, in this case, if the network service provider, there's actually a lot of red flags here. If your secondary replica becomes unavailable because your primary can't talk to it, it's technically offline. So you lose that voting member. So now you're down to assuming 1 out of 2, and 1 out of 2 is not majority, it's 50%. And I'm guessing there was no witness configured, hence why every time the network service provider would take this thing offline, probably do maintenance, they're going to be offline for as long as the network service provider does maintenance. And this is one of those things where the design of a failover cluster really impacts your availability group, whether you like it or not. Because it's not SQL Server that is providing high availability. It's leveraging the Windows Server Failover Clustering platform or the Cluster Resource Manager. So you really have to be very aware and understand and be well-versed. Because if this kind of thing happens and you don't know what to do, well, do we just wait until the network service provider does go back and restore our connectivity? What if you're losing hundreds and thousands of dollars by the hour? Are you just going to wait until they did? No, because it is the business's name on the line. It is the business on the line. And you have to be very aware of the impacts of losing quorum, right? There's so much to unpack in this. But another thing is, why would you have a 2-replica AG across data centers? Because you're paying for a very expensive SQL Server license, Enterprise Edition that is. You're paying for a very expensive SQL Server license, but you don't have real HA. This is fake HA. Just because you have an availability group doesn't mean it's highly available. Yeah, we joke around the fact that we call it always on, but it's really not always on. It's sometimes on. Alan Hurt calls it almost on. And that making the availability group always on is really not just the responsible of the platform, it's the responsible of the first person taking care of the platform, you. So you have to be well versed, well aware. You have to be solid on your understanding of how failover clustering works and how it impacts your availability groups. I mean, in this case, again, I don't really get why. I've seen more issues with designs like this than they solve problems. Okay, I would not, personally for me, I would not spend money on very expensive SQL Server Enterprise Edition licenses if I don't have true HA. I'll just leave it at that. Next question I have: we are considering deploying a failover cluster with always on. This is probably similar to this. Are there any gotchas to watch out for? Gotchas, number one, licensing. Yeah, I'm just going to throw it out there. Unless you're on Windows Server 2009, no, SQL Server 2009 licensing model, prior to that, you're only covered with one extra replica for standby. And we're looking at warm, hot standby, that is. So you have to pay for license for primary, and under SA, you don't have to pay for secondary. But if you decide to add another one, in this case for DR, you would have to pay for that in the context of SQL Server 2017 and earlier licensing models with software assurance. With SQL Server 2019, you're covered. So that's just one. And a lot of people are not really keen on looking at licensing because it's so confusing. So you better talk to your Microsoft licensing experts about that. Licensing is one gotcha. Number two, failover clustering. Failover clustering. And the reason for that is because when Windows Server 2008 was released, this is when Microsoft decided, sure, we're going to allow support for multi-subnet failover clusters, meaning you have cluster nodes on one data center and some cluster nodes on another data center. So the cluster nodes on your production data center are there for high availability, and maybe one or two more are there for disaster recovery. Hence why I said the previous question, there's a ton of red flags there. Okay, so gotchas, clustering. How many people on your team know how to manage a cluster, let alone a cluster across different data centers? That's something that you need to ask. What is your DR strategy and how does it look like? Do you just rely on automatic failover? How do you do that? A lot of people don't realize that in a setup like this, you can end up with a situation where your application is on one data center, but your databases are on another data center. The communication between the app and the database layer across two data centers, there's a lot of network latency there, but here's what I can guarantee you, they're going to blame the database for it. They are going, that's why we were called the default blame acceptor. They're going to blame the database for it. Not a database problem, but because that is how you've architected it, that's how you design it, then it's exactly how it works. So from licensing to your DR strategy to people responsible for dealing with a cluster stretch across multiple data centers. Number four, networking. How is the network connectivity between your production and your DR data center? Is that good enough for you? Is that something that you are going to struggle with? And when I say struggle with, because the reality is, if you have two different data centers, SQL Server is not the only traffic going through that. Your SharePoint stuff is going to go through that. If you have SharePoint, your backups are going to go through that if you're shipping backups to your disaster recovery site. Your Active Directory replication is going to go through that. Your DNS replication, which piggybacks on Active Directory, is going to go through that. What else? Your Exchange databases are going to go through that. What else? The MP3s that you've saved on your hard drive. Yeah, some people do that. This is more than just a network uh, bandwidth for SQL Server. SQL Server is just one of a million other things that is going through that pipe. So there is no guarantee that you are going to get dedicated bandwidth, even if you ask your network administrators. Because for them, the network administrators, and again, this is not to poke fun at them because I used to do that kind of work, they would prioritize the bandwidth based on what is really needed. I will repeat that. They would prioritize bandwidth based on what is needed. Why? Because it is expensive to maintain that network connectivity between two data centers. So they have to make sure that they're maximizing that bandwidth because they're paying for it. Well, not them, but business is paying for it. So they will do stuff like packet shaping. They would do stuff like optimizing the bandwidth. They would throttle stuff. And if SQL Server is pushing massive amounts of transaction log records across data centers, and the network administrators see that, they could, and I'm saying they will, they could throttle, it would shape the packet so that your transaction log records would take much longer to making it to your DR site. How's that going to affect your recovery point and your recovery time objectives as far as DR is concerned? Okay. What else about networking? How is your failover cluster configured to handle this? Meaning, go back to, I think it was the second question. First question. Go back to the first question. What about internode communication? If your failover cluster nodes in your production data center could not communicate well with the DR data center nodes, it will think that that node is not available. And this is typically measured in terms of the heartbeat timeout values. Same subnet delay, same subnet threshold, cross subnet delay, cross subnet threshold, cross site delay, and cross site threshold. A lot of these things have different values depending on the version of Windows Server operating system that you're dealing with. So what is the network latency between your production data center and your DR data center, and how is that being managed by the failover cluster? Do you tweak the same subnet, cross subnet? And I had a client 2 years ago where they did this exact thing because every time their network service provider would perform maintenance, they had an 8-node Windows Server Failover cluster, 4 of which are on Azure and 4 of which are on premises. And whenever their network service provider, and mind you, they have multiple network service providers, not just one, they would lose connectivity to some of the network cluster nodes, rather, and they would lose connectivity. There would be some latency. There will be buildup on not just the transaction log records on the primary replicas, because they run multiple primary replicas. In addition to that, there's network latency, and so the heartbeat messages are not being sent efficiently, which would start affecting the quorum. Just think about that for a second. You lose a network connectivity, you suddenly lose 4 out of 8 voting members immediately. So regardless of whether you have dynamic quorum, dynamic witness, the cluster still needs some time to process how to deal with that kind of. It will still consider it an outage because it does not have connectivity. And again, it's like I said, the concept of quorum is the most complex, convoluted, confusing concept, yet it is the most important one. Because if you lose quorum, you don't have a cluster. And that's one. Again, I'm reiterating a lot of these gotchas because a lot of these things we don't really think about when we're building a failover cluster that would stretch across different data centers. Nobody thinks about the disaster recovery strategy at that moment. Nobody. Well, very few. Because what they're focused on is the architecture. This is what I want to build, but they're not thinking about what if we need to invoke DR? How do we go about the DR strategy? Nobody thinks about other people involved in keeping this up and running. And when I say keeping this up and running, when you need to invoke your DR, who knows about how to deal with this? If you're the only person who knows how to deal with this and you're on vacation, then there's no DR because there's no you. Even if you write the best documentation ever, if you've never done it before, then it's all good on paper. It's kind of like what everybody's saying. It's all good on paper until it becomes real. If you're not aware of the network bandwidth requirements, of the impacts of the network bandwidth on the data center, on the failover cluster across data center, then you would have issues like, the cluster nodes are not available. Well, it is actually available. It's just that the heartbeat messages are not making it in time. And the most common mistake that I see a lot of people is to tweak the heartbeat settings. They would tweak the heartbeat settings from the default to 40 seconds. I mean, come on, what's the point of having a failover cluster if you're just going to tell the cluster, oh, it's okay if we don't get heartbeat messages in 40 seconds time? Are you sure? And like I said, these are the things that you have to consider, but none of them are purely technical. Sure, you can tweak the cluster heartbeat settings. It's a technical approach, but what is the real problem? Is the real problem some network bandwidth restrictions? Is it some packet shaping or bandwidth throttling? What is the real problem? Is it because SQL Server is pushing a ton of transaction log records across the wire that it's not making it in time, even if you configure it to an async replica? There's a ton of things that are going on under the covers. Okay, it is again, it's an hour is not even enough to explain how the quorum works, how failover clustering leverages the quorum, how it is the most important yet the most confusing, complex, and convoluted concept there is. And I don't know why the Microsoft documentation is like that. Okay, that's one of the reasons why I cover more than 1/3 of short shameless plug out there. One of the it's covered in 1/3 of my entire training program, the SQL Server Always On Available Groups, the Senior DBA's Ultimate Field Guide. Because again, even if you're only concerned or if you're only taking care of the SQL Server databases and the AG, you got to know what's going on. You got to be well versed. You got to know what to do. And you have to let other people on your team know as well. Because if there is an outage as a side effect of losing quorum, then you don't have a database. If your cluster does not have quorum, then you don't have an AG. And that's how important this is. And I cover this in my 10-week program, the SQL Server Always On Available Groups, the Senior DBA's Ultimate Field Guide. And here I go again. I got like 2 more questions. I'll probably save it for another another session, maybe part 2 of this, because it really is that important. We are talking about the foundational platform that is Windows Server Failover Clustering that makes Always On Available Groups highly available. Without this, SQL Server Always On Available Groups will not be highly available. This is what makes high availability happen. And if you have any questions or follow-up questions, or maybe you need help with anything Always On Available Groups, and that includes Windows Server Failover Clustering, maybe you're thinking, my boss has given me a responsibility to build this, and I don't know what to do, and it's freaking me out, and I feel like my career is on the line, my job is on the line, and I've been doing a ton of searches on the internet, and I don't know, it's making me all the more confused. Let's have that chat. Use the link on the screen, schedule a call with me, and we'll flesh that out. We'll have that conversation. And we are going to look at, what are your goals? Is it just to build a failover cluster with an availability group? We'll look at what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and if it is in alignment with what the business really needs. Because sometimes, the CIO or the manager just watched a webinar that talks about always on available groups, and all of a sudden, hey, I want you to do this. Okay? Or maybe you are managing a Windows Server Failover Clustering platform running SQL Server Always On Available Groups, and you've been shoved into it, not having any clue at all what to do with it, how to manage it, yet you're now being responsible for it. It's just like, an intern being told you got to do surgery on this. If you need help, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have a talk. And I will walk you through what your goals really are. And at the end of it, I'll be giving you the strategy on how to achieve those goals. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have a chat. I can guarantee you it's going to be the best 45 minutes to an hour investment in your career as a SQL Server DBA. I mean, just think about that for a second. There's a ton of job opportunities for SQL Server DBAs, and one of the requirements is you need to know how to work with SQL Server always on. Sometimes you just call it always on high availability. So yes, again, take advantage of that. Use that link, schedule a call, and let's talk. I'm looking forward to having you on those calls. And that is about it for this Friday edition of the. I shouldn't be calling it Friday because then it would mean I would have a Wednesday, a Tuesday. For this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show, I may have to schedule another part 2 of this because I got 2 more questions on this. Join me again next week for another topic. And if you have questions that you want answered, use the link below. There's a forum that would direct you to where you can submit your questions so that we can answer them, or I can answer them live, so you can watch the recordings in the future. Also refer to some of the recordings of the earlier episodes. If this has been valuable to you, share it to your friends or colleagues. And that's about it for this week's episode. Enjoy the rest of your day. Because it's Friday, I can say enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again next week.